In October of 1990, during my freshman year of college, the great American conductor and composer Leonard Bernstein died. At the time, I didn't even know who Leonard Bernstein was, except for that line from that REM song. The other night I drifted nice, continental drift divide, mountain said in a line, Leonard Bernstein. Nevertheless, after his death, I became obsessed with him. I read his biographies, watched his concerts, collected pictures and articles at the library, since this was before the internet. The very first CD I ever bought was Leonard Bernstein's final concert before his death, conducting the Boston Symphony. And I didn't even own a CD player. By the beginning of my senior year, in spite of all of my training as a church musician and choral singer, I was determined to become the next Leonard Bernstein. So my conducting teacher said, Jim, if you ever want to stand in front of an orchestra, you better know how to play a stringed instrument. Fair enough. So in my mind, the violin was a girl's instrument, the viola read the wrong clef, and every bass player I'd ever met was creepy. I took up the cello. And after a year of rigorous applied study on the cello, here's what I accomplished. Now with cheese. Thank you. Thank you very much. I decided that after a year of sowing my wild oats in the orchestra world, maybe stringed instruments were best left to the professionals. And I found my way like a lost sheep that you might hear about on Sunday, wandering back to the church, back to the organ, back to the choir, where my skills were much better suited. But it taught me an appreciation for stringed instruments, string players, and how things work in the orchestra world. Plus, I realized I can still play the cello on the organ. The idea of string stops on the organ is still a relatively new phenomenon. And by new, I mean the last 150 years. For organists, that's still pretty new. It was the late 19th century or so where organ builders, particularly in France, started to enlarge the organ, kind of like the orchestra was enlarging. And the organ builders said, why can't we make the organ sound more like an orchestra? And that way, one person, if she can't duplicate an orchestra, can at least imitate an orchestra with the sounds from the organ. So more exotic stops came about, like the clarinet, the English horn, the French horn, the tuba mirabilis. These enormous big stops came out of the organ in order to imitate the sound of the orchestra. And of course, if you're going to imitate the sound of an orchestra, you need to have strings. So organ builders started putting string stops on the organ so that you could sound or imitate the sounds of strings. And not every organ has a string stop, and if they do, it's only one or two. We have one string stop on our organ. It's called the Viola Da Gamba. And the Viola Da Gamba is an actual instrument from the Baroque period, sort of a forerunner of the cello. And it sounds like this. It's a very mild sounding stop, very thin and narrow scaled. If you were to look at it, it's a very thin pipe. And sometimes string stops will even have a covering over the mouth of the pipe that will further sort of obfuscate the sound, if that's the correct word. If you have a string stop, you almost always will have another stop that goes along with it, and that stop is called a celeste. So here is our regular stop, and here is our celeste. Let me do that again. Regular stop, celeste. Do you notice a difference? You don't really notice a difference until you play them together. Regular stop plus celeste. You hear that wave in there? For some reason, and string players, I don't know why organ builders think this, but anytime you have a string stop, organ builders will also usually add what's called a celeste, which is a whole other rank of pipes out of tune. I guess they assume string players just can't play in tune, so they add a stop called a celeste, meant to sound like a full section of string players. I, for one, know that string players have the best ears, so I don't know why, but that's the way it is. And if you have a string stop and a celeste, it does sound a little bit like a string section. There's a couple of tricks you can do too. You can super couple it, in other words, add the octave on top, which will make it sound a little bit more like a string section. You can add the tremolo, which is vibrato that you'll see string players do. Now we're kind of starting to sound like a string section. I use that sound a lot when I'm introducing a hymn. I might put a little string accompaniment behind a solo stop. Like you might hear in an orchestra. The strings accompany a solo stop. Today, for Rheinberger's 8th trio, what I want you to do is listen to the bass. I'm playing the trio, of course, so there's a top part and a bottom part. Let me see, let me go ahead and... You'll hear these two sounds in the manuals. But what I really want you to listen for is the pedal, because you're going to hear the pedal go... boom, 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 boom. Like an old bass player playing pizzicato. Doom, ball, doom, ball. And that's what I'm going to show you that the string stop is really capable of doing on this organ. And in addition to accompanying, it really makes a great bass stop. So here is Rheinberger's 8th trio. Pay particular attention to that bass line. Come back tomorrow. We've got some odds and ends to clean up.